Good afternoon. I'm Chris Mueller-Smith, and I'm going to talk about single sensor estimation of radioactivity via blind block-partitioned tensor decomposition, something I've been working on with Professor Spashuvik. The problem that we're considering, we have a set of transmitters whose transmissions are all being detected by a single sensor. And we're assuming that the transmissions from these sensors are non-orthogonal in both time and frequency. So here's a sort of cartoon of what the spectrogram might look like, where you see a bunch of energy lumps overlapping each other as the transmissions turn on and off. But we know that underlying all that, there's actually a bunch of individual signals. And ideally what we'd like to do is somehow separate out all those signals and identify certain parameters of them, such as, in particular, the activity, their on-off activity in time, and things like the power spectrum, which are the main two things that we focus on, although there are a few other parameters we might be able to estimate in addition. So in the setup, all the transmitters might be broadcasting with various different types of modulation schemes. So at the sensor, a sort of brute force approach would be to build separate receivers in your sensor to sort of detect each of the possible modulations. Although to do that, you sort of have to be aware of what the various signal parameters are of each of the modulations. And then what about for these transmissions, these transmitters with the question mark modulations, the ones that we don't necessarily know or have not built a receiver for? How are we going to detect those? So building separate receivers is not something that we would like to do. It doesn't seem like it'd be a very successful path. So we consider the system model where we have M transmitters, which are all broadcasting over M individual channels, which are then detected at our sensor with some added noise in there. The transmitters are all broadcasting using modulations that are either linear or can be approximated by linear or finite sums of linear modulations. We assume that they're packetized, that is, the transmitters are turning on and off in time, and that their transmissions are all overlapping in time and frequency, as we showed on that spectrograph representation. Now, before we are actually able to do the signal separation signal separation, we have to do a little bit of pre-processing, where we group statistically similar receptions into similar signal groups. So, for instance, we would say that these segments where there's no transmission is signal group type 1, just the blue is type 2, blue and green type 3, and just the green is type 4. Now, the reason we do this is that for each of those segments, we'd like to estimate an anti-diagonal slice of the trispectrum, which is a sort of it's the Fourier transform of a fourth order cumulant, which is a higher order statistic, which we are able to use in our setup in order to estimate the various characteristics that we'd like to.
Can I just back you up one slide?
Yes.
One more slide. Okay, so you're assuming there's something you're measuring and you're projecting it onto a set of functions, right? That's what it looks like you're doing.
So for the modeling, we're assuming that they can fit into this. We're assuming that you can sort of fit the modulations into being approximated by these sort of sums of linear modulations.
I think I'm asking a slightly different question. Those PMRs, those are assumed known?
They are not known to us. They are the pulse shape, the pulse shape of the signal.
So you're going to measure something, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's going to come into your receiver, and you're going to have to decompose it in some sort of way.
Yes.
So maybe we're not there yet. Maybe I'm being premature.
Yeah, we don't have to know those a priori. They're something that we learn eventually.
Thank you.
Right, so we estimate an anti-diagonal slice of the trispectrum for each of the groups that we've identified. And then, so this is, right, so we estimate the anti-diagonal slice. The components of the tridimension, of the slice that we've measured for each of the groups have several components. At the very top level, we have the channel response, this H sub m, and the signal trispectrum. And then this CIM over here indicates whether it's a 0 or 1, which indicates whether that particular signal is on or off in that particular group. And then we have the noise trispectrum, which in our scenario, we're assuming that the noise is additive white Gaussian, which in the trispectrum ends up being 0, so it can drop off. Delving down further, the signal trispectrum consists of the sum of the R sub m linear signals that are approximating that top level signal. So it's the sum of the sub-signal symbol sequence, trispectrum, modified by the magnitude of the pole shape. And then the symbol sequence trispectrum is the fourth order cumulant of the symbol sequence, which is unique for various types of modulations. And then it's scaled in this case by the symbol period timing to give us this constant K sub mr. We take that continuous version of the trispectrum and discretize it into an array consisting of NFB by NFB, the number of frequency bins. So we discretize it over the frequency spectrum that we've observed, and then we stack it together in the third dimension, each of the slices for each of the ICL groups. So at Milcom, we presented a paper that explored fitting this decomposition to just the straightforward canonical decomposition parallel factors tensor model, which is sort of described at the top here, which is the outer product of the sum of the outer product of three vectors. And we found that this gave us good performance for linear modulations, but poor performance for nonlinear modulations because the decomposition using the CP tensor model is not unique. So we moved on to looking at performing this decomposition using a block-partitioned tensor model. So this is the general structure of a block-partitioned tensor where the three factor matrices A, B, and C are partitioned. The first two factor matrices A and B are partitioned into sub-factor matrices, where each sub-factor matrix consists of R sub m columns. And then the corresponding factor matrix column in C applies to all the columns in the partitions according to A and B, so that you end up with entries in your tensor that are the outer product of A and B, and then in the third dimension, it's expanded out by the C factor matrix column. So you can see the similarities between the general block-partitioned tensor and our trispectrum, the entries in the general block-partitioned tensor and the entries in our trispectrum block-partitioned tensor, with the only real difference being that we have repeated column entries in the factor matrix here with this F and F instead of having different ones, A and B, and then an additional scaling factor here, which is K, which actually doesn't really change the structure in any significant way because it can be absorbed into any of the other factor matrices without changing anything. So for our trispectrum slice, the block-partitioned tensor formulation is a little bit different than the general case because we have, like I mentioned, we have the repeated factor matrix, F. And each of the columns of the factor matrix F are going to contain versions of the power spectrum of each of the signals that are in that the sensor is observing. So the structure of the tensor that we're looking at can be described by this equation at the bottom, where we have the outer product of the sub-factor matrices with themselves, and then outer product with the activity sequence. So sort of from a graphical version, you can see it as the top level factor tensor is this main one y, which is the sum of a bunch of subtensors, y1 through ym, where each of the subtensors is a outer product of the two of columns of the factor matrix summed together, and then outer product with that. So there are a lot of current strategies for decomposing block partition tensors out there. The main ones are based on alternating least squares, where they go from, they try to do a least squares fit for one factor matrix, and then with the other two factor matrices fixed, and then move on to the next factor matrix with two factor matrices fixed, and then the third factor matrix with the other factor matrices switch, and keep going on that, keep rotating through them in a round robin sort of sense until it converges to some sort of solution where the change in fit doesn't vary very much anymore. Now these decomposition algorithms all are non-blind in that they already know the partitioning. And the ALS strategy decomposition algorithms are not intended to work with repeated factor matrices. There are some slight modifications that people suggested to make them work with repeated factor matrices, which essentially is pretend that your repeated factor matrix is actually two different factor matrices and try to alternate until those two factor matrices approximately match up. So the current decomposition algorithms that are available don't really work well for our situation because we don't know the partitioning a priori, and we have this repeated factor matrix, which, like I mentioned, is not particularly good, or which the alternating least squares strategy doesn't work very well for. So what we did was we took the block partition tensor formulation and changed it around and tried to make it look more like the CP tensor model. So we used the shorthand here from the CP tensor model, which I just remind you of again, and we present it as we present our block partition version as a CP tensor in this way, where we've added this additional matrix P, which essentially expands the activity matrix C out to match the dimensions of our power spectrum matrix F. So it has this sort of structure here where you can see it has block rows of zeros along each of the rows, and blocks of one along the sort of diagonal of the matrix, and a lot of zeros on the off-diagonal areas. So what we can say about that is that we know that P is R sparse and that there are exactly R non-zero entries in our expansion matrix. So this gives us sort of an idea of what we can use as a strategy to blindly estimate what the grouping is and try to do the block decomposition in a blind way. Our estimation strategy is to essentially minimize this objective function at the top of the slide, where we have a least squares fit for our tensor to the measured estimated tensor. And then we have an L1 regularization over here, which is there to enforce the sparsity on the W matrix. This is a very common form that many of you might recognize for enforcing sparsity in a particular matrix when you're doing an optimization. And we know that under certain conditions, the block partition decomposition of Y is unique, up to permutation and scaling of the columns. And what we expect to get out of this optimization when we perform it is that we end up with estimates of the signal's power spectra in our estimate of F, estimates of the signal's on-off activity in time in the estimate of C, and estimates of our signal grouping in W. So we ran this through a few very brief simulations to sort of get a sense of how this is working, and we haven't thoroughly explored this as in-depth as we'd like, but initially we've considered a few configurations of 3 overlapping signal groups where each signal group experiences different Rayleigh fading channels under varying SNR. And the idea is that we have a significant amount of overlap in the three signals, as is indicated in this this power spectrum plot, which is supposed to be representative of some of the signal configurations we looked at. And you might not be able to see it very well from out there, but there are actually three signals here. They just overlap each other a lot, where there's this red group, which consists of two subsignals, this blue group, which consists of three subsignals, and this greenish group, which consists of two subsignals. And our preliminary results from Monte Carlo simulations indicate that, especially at higher SNR, we're able to fairly accurately estimate the activity sequences and get pretty good estimates of the power spectrum. And this sort of a second sort of takeaway from this is that the difference between the two colors is mainly that we use different frequency resolution. And we found that the higher frequency resolution, you get better performance, but the trade-off there is that the higher the frequency resolution, that means you're doing your minimization over a much larger number of variables, which sort of results in the decomposition taking longer. So it's that trade-off between how accurate do you want to be and how long do you want the decomposition to take in order to perform your estimation. So just to sort of illustrate, this is one example of a estimated PS power spectrum that we've gotten out of our algorithm, just to sort of illustrate the point where the solid lines are the actual power spectrum and the dashed lines are the estimated power spectrum. And this is clearly a simple case with just two signals. But the point is that it illustrates that we can reasonably accurately estimate the power spectrum. And then just to make it more complicated, this is an additional view with four subsignals, all very densely packed into each other and overlapping. And we can see that it actually manages to do a pretty decent job of estimating the power spectrum there as well. So continuing our work, we sort of have to, we haven't come up with a good strategy for appropriately choosing our regularization coefficient. And that choosing that coefficient really affects how well our estimate decomposes the tensor into good estimates. We're also investigating trying to find alternative algorithms that will allow us to avoid tuning of the regularization coefficient. So in order to take that problem out of our algorithm. We also are trying to find alternative algorithms that do not require estimating appropriate values for M and R, that is the M being the number of main level signals and R being the total number of subsignals. We prefer it if we could just pick a number of subsignals that we'd like to estimate up to and somehow estimate M from that. We also are going to need to characterize our algorithm performance in varying conditions and various signal orthogonality in both time and frequency in order to get a better sense of how this algorithm functions and when it works and when it fails. And then ideally, we'd also like to implement this eventually in a software-defined radio. Thank you.